Okay, everybody, this is going to be part 2 of our World War II notes. In the previous section, we were sort of talking about the lead up to World War II. So we had discussed sort of the rise of Adolf Hitler, and we had talked about the his invasion of Poland and how that kickstarted World War II, and the U.S. Not joining until after Pearl Harbor. But in this video, we are going to talk about specifically Georgia in World War II. How did Georgia get affected by World War II? And fundamentally, before we even get into the sort of nitty-gritty, we just have to know that World War II was important for Georgia for one reason, and it's the fact that it brought money and jobs. Okay, that's going to be the big thing. All right, World War II brought money and jobs to Georgia, so that's what we really need to know. Okay, so what we need to know is that Georgia played a key role in World War II. Actually, we were sort of very instrumental in actually outfitting the troops in multiple ways. The first way was the fact that in Georgia we actually had a pretty famous plane being built. We had this place called the Bell Bomber Plant in Marietta, which is not far from where Lost Mountain Middle School is, where you guys live at. And at that Bell Bomber Plant, they were building the B-29 bomber, which I'm gonna get rid of this horrible handwriting over here, and you can actually see a picture of the B-29 bomber right here, and as you can see, it says that this is one of the most technologically advanced planes that we had in World War II. But fundamentally, this plant brought 30,000 jobs to Georgia, and when the war was over, the plant laid empty for about 6 years, and then it gets bought by Lockheed Martin, which is very, very important because Lockheed Martin is still there today. Some of your parents, some of your friends' parents, cousins, somebody probably works at Lockheed Martin in one way or another. The other thing we have to know is that because of World War II, we get Dobbins Air Force Base, which is also in Marietta. And Dobbins Air Force Base is a really cool place. If you ever get the chance, you should go to see the air show that they do there. It sort of demonstrates, the planes and what they can do. Very, very cool. All right, so we're going to continue on. We've got the Bell Bomber Plant, which is Lockheed Martin today, and then Dobbins Air Force Base, which is still there today. All right, next thing we got to know is that just like in World War I, in World War II, Georgia had more military bases than any other state. So that is going to be very, very important. You're going to want to highlight that. Again, we mentioned Fort Benning right here, which is a huge base where they're trained infantrymen. So boots on the ground, gun in hand. If you're going to be, a soldier on the front line, there was a good chance you went through Fort Benning because that's where, that was the biggest training camp in the United States at the time. What we need to know is that these military bases that they built during World War II and World War I are still there today, and they continue to bring millions of dollars into the state, and thousands of jobs are reliant upon it every single year. So that's very, very important. And remember, we talked about how while FDR did a lot in the 1930s to try to make the Depression better for citizens through things like the New Deal, and we talked about those individual programs like Social Security and the CCC and things like that, it was actually World War II that ends the Depression. And as you can see, World War II is bringing millions and millions of dollars specifically into Georgia. The next thing we have to talk about with Georgia is the fact that we actually were responsible for building huge cargo ships that brought goods, such as, I should say war goods, things like guns and munitions and uniforms and food and supplies to the Allies in Europe and in the Pacific. So those ships that we were building, we actually built them in our port cities in Brunswick and Savannah. Remember, we talked about how those are still massive trade ports today at the very beginning of the year. But what we know is that in Brunswick and Savannah, they built what they called Liberty ships, which is what we have here. These are just huge cargo ships. But if you look, it says that over 15,000 jobs were brought to Georgia because of the building of these ships. All right, we got 3 slides left, guys, so we're almost there. We got to talk about 2 famous Georgians from this time period. The first guy we got to talk about is this guy right here. His name is Richard Russell. Richard Russell was important because he was a U.S. senator for for 38 years. And what you need to know is that the term for a senator is 6 years, okay? So if he was in office for 38 years, that means that he actually won 7 elections. Now, he wouldn't have served all of it. He, stepped down before he served that last term. But it's very, very, important to kind of put that into perspective so that you can see just how popular this guy was. And the reason why he was so popular was because he brought a lot of jobs and a lot of money into the state of Georgia, and he also started a pretty important program, so we're going to talk about that too. But what we need to know is that while he was a senator, he served on something called the Armed Services and Appropriations Committee. And when you see government speak and you start to see the word appropriations, that's always has something to do with money, okay? And so what that means is that that position he was serving in Congress was in charge of spending the money and on the military, okay? And so he was a big proponent of increasing military spending, but because he was from Georgia and he was in charge of getting to decide how much money Congress was going to authorize for the military, and remember, Congress is the one who has to, specifically the House, has to be the one who decides how much money we spend. Basically, he was going to make sure that that spending impacted Georgia, and the way that it impacted Georgia was through bringing and maintaining those military bases we talked about before. Another important sort of thing that he brought to Georgia through this military spending was the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, which is a huge, huge deal that we have this in Georgia. It brings a lot of sort of technology and influence to the state of Georgia, the fact that we have this here. If you guys remember a couple of years ago when we had the Ebola outbreak and people were coming from Africa into the United States with this, it was the CDC who was in charge of, quarantining people, who was in charge of trying to come up with some kind of a cure for that disease. So the Centers for Disease Control, every year when we have the flu outbreak, they're the ones who kind of try to decide, how bad is it going to be, what kind of vaccine do they need to develop. Hugely, hugely important sort of organization. The other thing that we need to know about Richard Russell, besides the fact that he brings tons of money into the state through military spending, is that he actually started the free lunch program. So, for low-income students, this is a very, very important program. This makes sure that all students get to eat lunch when they're at school, and today that's been expanded in a lot of schools to actually include breakfast. So this just makes sure that all students have the opportunity to learn on a full stomach and learn at their best ability. Okay, the second guy we have to talk about is Carl Vinson. He is also a congressman. So Stevens was in the Senate. Vinson is going to be in the House of Representatives. And something kind of interesting about him is that he was actually in the House for 51 years, which is the longest anybody has ever served in the U.S. House of Representatives. So, that's quite an accomplishment. But what we need to know about Vinson is, just like Stevens, he was very, very influential in sort of bringing money and jobs through the military into Georgia. And the way that he did that is that he was very sort of big on increasing the funding for the Navy. He actually gets this nickname, the father of the two-ocean Navy, because he was so big on increasing spending. He wanted to increase the size of the Navy to where we could patrol the Atlantic and the Pacific at all times, with these increase in the amount of ships that we have. And he was so sort of respected and loved by the Navy and the Army that they actually named a U.S. nuclear aircraft carrier after him today. So there is still a USS Vinson out there patrolling the ocean. One of my favorite quotes that I found from him was this one right here. You do need to know this. It says that the most expensive thing in the world is a cheap army and navy. And you might see that on a quiz or something. You will see that on a quiz. So what you need to know is that with this quote, what he is saying is that if you don't spend money on the army and the navy up front, it's going to be more expensive in the long run, because you might get taken over by another country, or you might lose a war, or you might lose a lot of lives, or things like that. So he was a sort of a proponent of spending money up front on the military and hoping that it leads to things being cheaper in the long run. So he was sort of very big on protecting the United States. The last things that we have to know about Carl Vinson is that while he was in Congress during the 1940s when World War II was going on, he was very big on sort of expanding the aviation program in the Navy. So if you look right here, he helps get 2 bills passed to expand the aviation program in the Navy, which we still have today. But during that time, they built 10,000 planes, they trained 16,000 pilots, and they established 20 air bases all around the country. And see, remember, we said that when they are building these bases and they're building these planes, somebody has to do all of that. So that creates jobs, and that gets the economy moving. And so just another example of how World War II and sort of the things around World War II really sort of helped bring the United States out of the Depression. It's because people are working and getting things ready for the war. Other things that I would want you to know about him, if you look right here, it says that because he was in Congress, it really helped coastal Georgia. And basically what that's referring to is the Liberty ships. Because he was in Congress and was really big on the Navy, when it was time for a state to be selected to build those Liberty ships, he made sure that that those jobs came to Georgia as well. Let's see, anything else that we have to know with Carl Vinson? Basically just that the impact of his sort of stance on expanding the military was massively important to bringing jobs to the state of Georgia. So that is the last of the notes that you have now. We will move a little bit further into World War II during the next coming days.